today's World Insight with Tian Wei. A summit between Putin and Trump is set to take place in July.
I think a lot of good things can come with meetings with people.
Could this be the icebreaker to thaw chilly relations between Moscow and Washington? And European Union leaders are holding a summit to tackle migration. Can they come up with a consensus dealing with tens of thousands of refugees turning up in European shores? Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live on CGTN. U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton visited Moscow to help set the stage for the summit between Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump. Both sides announced the Putin-Trump Summit will be held in Helsinki on July the 16th. Since the two sides have been at odds over accusations of election meddling and many of the other issues, what changes could this summit bring to their relations? Take a look at this first.
Mr. Trump's national security advisor was in Moscow for a meeting between Trump and Putin. They agreed to hold the much-anticipated summit between the two presidents in July.
Your visit to Moscow raises our hopes that we can take the first steps to restoring full-fledged relations between our governments.
Bolton said it was Trump's own desire to meet Putin.
And he judges correctly, in my view, that this bilateral summit between himself and President Putin is something that he needs to do and will do regardless of political criticism at home.
But the meeting is sure to bring criticism from certain corners of Washington. Already poor ties between the U.S. and Russia worsened in recent months over the conflict in Syria and the poisoning of an ex-Russian spy in the U.K. Washington joined a collective action by Western countries to expel Russian diplomats. Both sides are also at odds over Ukraine and the Middle East, as well as allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. The summit is seen as an icebreaker to get relations back on a positive track.
Well, I think we'll be talking about Syria. I think we'll be talking about Ukraine. I think we'll be talking about many other subjects, and we'll see what happens. So you never know. You never know about meetings what happens, right? But I think a lot of good things can come with meetings with people.
Since Mr. Trump took office 2 years ago, he only met his Russian counterpart in a few international events. Amid increasingly strained ties, the summit between Trump and Putin could indeed be a big step in improving relations.
So could the Putin-Trump or Trump-Putin summit be the break in diplomacy it's cracked up to be? Let's loop in our panelists with us in Beijing. Ye Hailin, who is with the National Institute of International Strategy under the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome, sir. In Arlington, Virginia, United States, we have William Courtney, a retired U.S. ambassador and adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Cooperation. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador. And in Moscow, Russia, we have Mark Sleboda, who is an international relations and security analyst. Welcome as well. Let me begin by asking you, Ambassador Sleboda, about the latest development between Russia and the United States. This is going to be July the 16th meeting between Putin and Trump. Very first time bilateral meeting, besides the earlier opportunities of meeting on multilateral basis.
Yeah, I think this is a meeting that President Trump has long wanted. He campaigned and won the election on the issue of improved relations with Russia, but the political witch hunt with the Russiagate scandal and investigation at home and opposition within Congress has prevented him thus far from meeting. So I think he's really looking to fulfill a campaign promise, but he's also looking to use this meeting primarily for domestic purposes. And I think the Russian government really needs to be careful about this, because Trump is all about political opportunism. And he's imagining how he can spin this into the midterm elections in the United States that could determine his political fate.
All right, Ambassador Courtney, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Ambassador Courtney, therefore, I want you to respond to our Russian guest who said earlier that President Trump is taking a political opportunity out of this bilateral meeting. And having said that, though, we know the so-called Russian meddling investigation is still going on. James Comey certainly is not a favorite name for President Trump.
President Trump ran primarily on trade and migration issues and improving the economy. Russia was not really a factor in the election. This appears to be more of a personal issue with Trump than a political issue. Trump himself has had some ties with Russia in the past, sponsoring a beauty contest in Moscow. He seems to want to have better relations, but the summit with Putin holds probably more risk than opportunity for President Trump in the United States. There's a strong bipartisan consensus, both Republicans and Democrats in Congress, to be pretty firm on Russia with regard to its aggression in eastern Ukraine, its annexation of Crimea, and its military intervention in Syria, which has involved a lot of atrocities.
So, Ambassador Courtney, with that in mind, is President Trump trying to stretch his muscles when he's having this bilateral meeting? Remember very clearly in our earlier quote, Mr. Bolton, who is being labeled as very hawkish within the administration, said this is a personal decision made by President Trump. He is just there in Russia trying to be a messenger. So it seems that there are words that he hasn't spoken and yet smoke bigger or louder than the ones that he already talked about. Ambassador Courtney.
Well, I think that's correct. So for President Trump, he will want to find ways to improve relations with Russia, and that's not a bad thing, because it's important for major powers, great powers, to have positive aspects of their relations, whether it's in consular activity, people-to-people diplomacy, commercial relations, and those provide ballast or an underpinning for a political relationship. But the president will have to deal with difficult political issues as well. Hopefully he can make some concrete progress on some of the lower profile issues, for example, reopening consulates that have been closed between Russia and the United States, and reanimating people-to-people exchanges.
Mr. Sloboda, I have to come back to you about the Russian side's analysis. I mean, you see this administration in Washington not necessarily having very good terms with their European allies. And also there are threats coming from President Trump suggesting that the U.S. is not going to contribute as it used to be to NATO, which is a defense alliance between the United States and its European allies across the Atlantic. So what would this mean? Plus, not to forget that there's trade wars, believe it or not, going on between the United States and some of its European allies, and maybe China as well. So under these circumstances, how is Russia going to meddle it well and keep that balance, that it's not going to offend anyone as a result of this meeting, but at the same time be able to push what Russia has in mind as the agenda?
Yeah, President Putin is going to be under a lot of pressure in this meeting because he has to deal with Trump's domestic politics at home, Trump's divisions with the EU and NATO, his trade war essentially on the entire world, threatening tariffs and sanctions against allies from Turkey all across Europe to Germany and so on. But there's a lot of U.S. illegal actions around the world, including the putsch that they have backed in Ukraine, that overthrew the democratically elected government and continues the mass murder and atrocities against its own civilians there, the U.S. Illegal proxy war and its military occupation of eastern Syria, and nearly constant and routine U.S. meddling in elections around the world. And Trump is going to be under pressure to bring this to the table and have some kind of dealing with it with the United States.
Right. Some of the controversial issues, I'm sure Ambassador Courtney wants to respond later, but for now, let me go to you, Mr. Ye, here in Beijing. You certainly see both sides coming from two analysts have concerns about this meeting. They see it it could be a political loss for actually the president of their own country. But at the same time, you see, these two are likely to meet, and President Trump said very clearly when he's meeting with the Portuguese leader at the White House, saying to the press that, you know, it's very important to develop, quote, good relationship with Russia and China, end of quote. So, Mr. Ye, how do you read President Trump now, his intention?
Yeah, I understand it's very good for American if you had a good relation with Russia and China, but the definition of good, what's the definition? Is it good for American, or good for the world, or good for Russia and China? So there's a lot of questions, but in my understanding, actually, Donald Trump's idea to get a better relation with, not very good, better, getting better relation with Russia is basically two reasons. Firstly, due to his personal ideology and his personal thought on the global issue, he really wants to get a better relationship with Russia. This is a personal judgment. Secondly, due to the domestic, the midterm election pressure, he has to take this chance to try to get rid of the so-called scandal. So based on these two reasons, he wants to meet President Putin. But for Russian side, I think only creating a warmly atmosphere is not enough for Russia. Russians want to see what's the actual achievements could be made by these two countries. So there's a lot of questions and the problems and issues between these two countries. I won't say such kind of a summit will create or repeat the history in 1986 when Gorbachev met President Reagan it's far away. So it's only a first step.
And nobody is suggesting that, Mr. Ye, but certainly great analysis over there. Ambassador Courtney, about that, if this is going to be a political makeup for President Trump about midterm election, he's certainly doing it with a lot of danger. What if the Russian side are asking really specific things? And what if the domestic constituencies, as you said earlier, are asking President Trump to raise some specific issues with Russia, which the other side certainly would not like?
Well, the Congress, for sure, is interested in President Trump's raising Russian election interference in the 2016 election here in the United States, Russian aggression in Ukraine, and Russian activities in Syria, where a lot of really humanitarian suffering is really a result of a kind of conflict that Bashar al-Assad with Russia and Iran have supported. So that will be an interest for Congress. For President Trump, the midterm elections, the timing of the midterm elections and the summit are not really a related issue. President Trump is concerned, of course, to have the Republican Party do well in the midterm elections, but this summit, unless there is some big problem, this summit will likely not have an impact on the midterm elections.
But Ambassador Courtney, just to be frank here, I mean, we know that President Trump is sailing politically right now, despite some of the controversy he had recently with some domestic issues, whether it's immigration or others. But you know what? Republicans are already calling the party like Trump Republican. And whoever the candidate during the 7 primaries that he tried to support has in a way already got some very good result, not to mention the midterm election. So when you are saying President Trump is only thinking about the bilateral relations between Russia and the United States, it seems that it's a little bit less than what exactly the content is. And by the way, why, in a way, would President Trump think it's important on a personal basis to develop relations with Russia? And what can the Congress do if he tries to go out there and do it? After all, the Congress has not reacted much about any of the things he has been doing.
You're correct that candidates in the primary elections, Republican primary elections that President Trump supported, tended to do well. The issue, though, for the midterm elections in November are the independents who are in between, if you will, the diehard Republicans and the diehard Democrats. And it's less clear how successful President Trump is going to be in convincing the independents to support his goals. But those elections are going to revolve around a number of issues, including the economy, the trade wars that have been started now, immigration issues, and others. The U.S.-Russian summit is just not likely to be that important an issue in the midterm elections, nor is the NATO summit that is coming up just before the summit with Putin, unless there are some unusual major problem in one of those summits.
Okay, Mr. Slabodot, here we go. President Trump, before meeting President Putin, he's going to go to the NATO summit. He's also going to visit the UK. Of course, this is already a series of exchanges he has had with his European counterparts. Some of those were not necessarily very pleasant at all. So is Russia going to be a supporting point for him in his still lack of strategy approach of international relations while he is coming further into his term, at least the first term?
Yeah, I think President Trump has long wanted to bring a much-needed dose of realism and kind of transactional relationship with other great powers to U.S. foreign policy, something that he's met a great deal of resistance from the blob and the deep state in the United States, and from many of his European allies as well, at least some of the older ones, although he seems to be receiving support from the new Prime Minister of Italy and the Chancellor of Austria, and that's going to make these meetings really rather interesting. Trump has, in many ways, his actions have alienated many of his traditional allies, and he's called into question the value and the cost of this NATO alliance and the immense U.S. military footprint right up on Russia's borders in Europe that it maintains at great expense, while Europeans are kind of bandwagoning along and not paying their fair share. So I think Trump is facing, this is combined with pulling out of the Iran agreement, which was not favored on in Europe. Trump is facing a great deal of political isolation from traditional U.S. allies, and he may be looking at this meeting as a way of legitimizing and bringing the U.S. out of some of the isolation that it has been under.
Well, Mr. Ye, there are things that on people's mind. When both sides announce at the same time talking about they're going to discuss national relationship with one another, they're also going to discuss international issues of common concern. For example, the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue could be one of those that both countries are having a part in. They are the former members of the six-party talks. We want to remember that. And having said that, though, there are also issues in the Middle East. Syria is certainly one of those, but there are others as well. Meanwhile, there's issues. For example, China has been developing quite close relationship with Russia. If you see the interactions between Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Russian President Vladimir Putin, it's enormous amount for every year over the past 2 years. So, Mr. Ye, how is China looking at the roadmap, if there is any, President Trump is setting for him leading up to the midterm election about international relations?
I don't think that international issue will be the crucial for the midterm
No, it is
election.
not?
Yeah, but for the issues you mentioned, probably will be discussed during this summit. I think these two presidents will spend a lot of time on Syria case because they really need to find a kind of a solution or compromise for the two sides to avoid the further confrontation. But the Korean Peninsula, I think they won't spend much time because now the situation is manageable. And for China, I even doubt whether the President Putin and President Donald Trump will mention China as a factor because obviously two presidents, they all know their relationship with China, no matter for the US side or for the Russian side, won't be the very key issue for their relation with another big country. So in China's side, we will hold the neutral stance for these two countries, and we hope these two giants, the global giant, could through this summit to result some neutral or balanced situation and to avoid the further confrontation. But personally, I don't think such kind of the summit will bring so huge achievement for this world.
Ambassador Courtney, what do you think?
Well, with regard to Russia-Chinese relations, it's important that they do have good economic and cultural and other relations. Russia is in the middle of two of the three largest markets in the world, China and Europe. So it has a key role to play in promoting commerce in that big, vast region of the world. On the other hand, the United States is concerned that both Russia and China are seeking spheres of influence by using coercive measures. In the case of Russia, by invading Ukraine, also invading Georgia in 2008, and of course China with some of the East and South China Sea island issues. So I think from that standpoint, the sphere of interest issue with regard to Russia will be an important issue at the Putin summit, but not with regard to China.
I'm sure, Ambassador Courtney, the Chinese and the Russian guests will not agree with your earlier statement. Having said that, though, we are running out of time for this discussion. Mr. Sloboda, I want to come back to you about some of the specific issues, particularly in the Trump administration. You heard about the Secretary of State Pompeo talking about the U.S. is still trying to pressure its European counterparts to severe trade ties with Russia. But on the other hand, you also see National Security Advisor, Mr. Bolton, going to Russia on behalf of President Trump. So it could see that there are already quite some controversies within a very small group of the key decision makers or advisors of the White House. What can we expect if things are already this intense, even within a small group of power?
Yeah, I don't think there's much agreement between Trump and many of his advisors, certainly not with John Bolton, on the issue of the United States. But I think Trump is going to try to use this meeting as leverage against European countries and in NATO. The specter of improved relations with Russia is actually appalling many of these, and he may use this as leverage against them. Likewise, he can't meet any of his foreign policy goals in Iran and North Korea without Russian assistance of some kind, or at least Russia abstaining from some of these issues.
I see.
Likewise, I think we're going to see a fallback to some of the measures that the U.S. and Russia always go back to when their relations hit a low point. Nuclear non-proliferation, arms control, and strategic stability. And we're looking at a new START treaty and an intermediate range nuclear forces treaty that are due to expire. And the two countries really need to start dealing with setting rules of the road going forward for these and strategic issues, as well as cyber warfare, hypersonic weapons, machine learning, and artificial intelligence in the military, and so on.
I'm not sure whether they will be able to handle all of these issues. If one or two of them could be talked about, well, mutually, that's already an achievement. Mr. Ye, a final word from you, very briefly.
Yeah, I hope they can result some positive, but I really doubt. I even think such kind of a summit will bring some negative impact to the midterm election in the United States, but it won't bring anything to President Putin in Russia.
Negative to whom? Well, that's a question mark. Thank you so much, Ye Hailin, William Courtney, and Mark Sloboda. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our live program.